Show. He's Ian Dobson and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss defending the undefendable, the NSA and mass surveillance. Tim.
During one of my college classes, I remember this liberal guy who, when Edward Snowden was in the news at that time, and he made the comment that, if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't be concerned about surveillance, or you shouldn't really be concerned about, because it's sort of like a kooky thing to be worried about. I quickly, and I was somewhat of a left libertarian at the time, so I quickly brought up the fact that and it's mainstream history that like people like MLK Jr. and Malcolm X were the FBI, Edgar Hoover, and various other organizations were spying on them. This is just common knowledge here. So I quickly brought up as a left libertarian, somewhat at the time, in that sense. And you in a while back sent forward me a movie, The Lives of Others, which is a movie about surveillance. It occurs in East Germany. And the sort of police chief or the surveillance, the lead surveillance, ends up not being entirely on board. He's on board with what he's doing. And eventually he ends up being like a mailman after the collapse of the East Germany state. And he has to spy on this. And previously he was spying on this artist theater guy. And it turns out he's making a play, or he's writing letters that are critical of the current regime, and he's making valid criticism of the current regime. So the obvious reason to be afraid of surveillance is that if the state makes something illegal that ought to be legal or ought to be permitted, that would be the obvious case of why surveillance is a bad. People surveil each other, though. This is something that, as I do think there's a certain sense in which, people hire private eyes. So like surveillance in a sense is kind of like checking to see if someone's lying. So if you think such and such is having an affair, or such and such is, I don't know, a secret criminal, surveillance can help you figure out. It's basically detective work to see if you actually are what you say you are. This goes back to, if you don't have anything to hide, should you be afraid of surveillance? So like a lot of stuff, like people, if people didn't get Jeffrey Epstein stuff, for example, if he had to, it's a classic blackmail operation, but all the people were willingly entrapped themselves in the situation. He just happened to film it, and he had a blackmail on him. If he didn't do the terrible thing, you wouldn't have anything to hold over you. And also, people hire private eyes to spy on each other all the time. And actually, as Edward Snowden and Oliver Stone discuss this, a lot of what some of this NSA will use is they're just using personal matters. It's not political. They're just, it's like anybody else at a business. They're using their powers, and they just have to have easy access to people's private messages, so they look at their girlfriend's private messages. So in that sense, surveillance, that's not necessarily a civil liberties violation in the strict. It is a civil liberties violation, but it's not a civil liberties violation in the sense that they're trying to stop people from organizing against the state or something like that. That's just sort of like commonplace here. And historically, had organizations like the Pinkertons, who were basically just spying on labor organizers and so forth. Again, this goes back to the lying thing. If you think labor unions should be permitted, then you should be concerned if the state outlaws it, and then private corporations hire Pinkerton private eyes to go after them, in a sense. So, Swithin, what do you think of surveillance? The obvious thing is, in the sort of local example of surveillance, let's say if you spy on your spouse, you think you suspect your spouse to be cheating. This is the common plot of a lot of Hitchcock type movies, or Hitchcock short radio shows. And oftentimes it's rooted in paranoia, but sometimes they find out. But if you're being an upstanding person, you have nothing to fear if the state, if someone is surveilling you. If indeed you are what you say you are. So in that sense, it's very much like lying here. I did make the point about the anarchist point, where it's what is permitted. If you're doing something that should be permitted, but it has to be sort of closeted in the sense, then that's more of the quote-unquote issue there. So Swithin, what do you make of this? Are you concerned that the NSA collects everyone's data? mean, I'm not entirely. I don't know really what to do because like I know that Google and Facebook and Twitter and all these other various megacorps are going to spy on them, and even if they didn't, even if they had libertarian, even if they had Glenn Greenwald running them, it seems like this is just like a perfect. It's just like a honeypot. The state's going to find a way, or private people are going to find a way into these massive databases. Like I mean, you can look at your Facebook messages from 5 years ago. It's just there. I mean, most people don't encrypt their stuff, as David Friedman would point out very highly. It's just. I mean, again, this goes back to the commenter. If you don't have anything to hide, why, uh, why be concerned about it? So, overall, I wouldn't say I'm totally on that position, but I do think there is at least some merit in there. So, then, what would you make on the merits of this position and the merits of surveillance?
I think your historical point is interesting. That people would get private detectives, and also in sort of more traditional societies, um, you would pretty much everything you do would be out in the open because lots of stuff would just take place outdoors, and you wouldn't be particularly anonymous. Everyone would know who you were, and so you could say that well, you're kind of surveilled there. And so the question is it really that different? And then continuing that line of thought, you could argue that sort of like the post Second World War period is a sort of a weird point in history where you have sort of the least surveilled society. Now, why do I say that? Well, because you've got transport which is sort of good enough and travels you far enough such that you don't have as stronger communities within cities as you had historically, so they can't kind of keep an eye on you. Um, and because you're in a city and you can travel around, no one really knows who you are, and you can basically do what you want. There's no one sort of looking over and going, "Oh, what's he doing there?" and people sort of incurring social opprobrium. Um, so the question then is: if that's unusual, we're sort of getting back to a more of a traditional society. Although the big difference is, whereas in a traditional society, you'd be surveilled by basically people you knew or people who were particularly close to you or, within a few degrees of separation, for instance. Where essentially now you have people who are completely uh, anonymous, well, at least to you, and you are to them. You're just a name, as it were, not really a person. And that, I think, makes a big difference because you could argue, and not in all cases, but in many cases, the people who were surveilling you, as it were, when you were in a traditional society, had your interests at heart. They wanted you to be better off, or at least the family or a group that you were a part of. Whereas when it comes to sort of surveillance by the government in the modern sort of technological society, they don't know who you are. They don't really care about you. Uh, they may not even care about what they're doing. They're just getting paid to do it. And so, sort of the way the surveillance kind of works could be it could be treated as somewhat different. When it comes to surveillance, I suppose we still don't have yet mind reading. So you could always argue you've still got the ultimate private space in your own head. Historically, you could have written a journal, and now you might blog and put it on your computer, and that's easier to access um, than being written on paper. And I suppose that's the biggest difference. I think things that you historically you might have thought were relatively private. Now, clearly, people could open your letters. You send someone a letter, someone could put an iron on it and open it up and read it and put it back and make it look like it hasn't been seen. But it seems like it require a lot more effort, and also to the extent that more of your life is sort of digital. It's more there's more scope for measurement of what you are doing. Um, so I think that would be a relevant difference. Your point on encryption is a good one. Most people don't bother to encrypt Now, I suppose the question arises: would, if you had a sort of IP-free technological development and stuff, would you be able to get really user-friendly um, consumer products which could encrypt things well? I mean, to some extent, you had a growth of Signal and Telegram when WhatsApp were sort of wavering on encryption. Um, but you are right; it does seem to be the case that people care most about convenience, and if it's the case that the megacorps harvest their data, they don't particularly care. Um, I suppose it gets to the heart of what should other people know about you. I think is the question. Are there should there be purely private spaces, and then should there be spaces which are not entirely private? By private, I mean it's like you as an individual, and then are there some sort of like semi-private spaces, and then are there sort of like public spaces? So, for instance, if you walk outside your house wearing particular clothing, can you legitimately object for someone taking a photograph of you? Oh, and actually, that's another thing as well. It's not just random people. Other individuals can easily surveil people now because you can record conversations. You can take photos of people where you historically couldn't because you'd need a camera that you have to carry around big and bulky. Whereas now you've got a phone which can record and take video, take photos, etc. Um, so I think ultimately those types of questions are going to be the ones that need to be asked. But I do agree with you. Clearly, the biggest problem is when you're being surveilled to do something that should be legal but isn't, and you're going to be punished ultimately for doing it if you're caught. That would be clearly the worst situation with surveillance.
A lot of the punishment is actually shadow punishment, where it's not the state formally doing so, or it's not even it's the state and the sort of mega corporations sort of getting in agreement over things, uh, that they should, they both, enough people within the mega corporation agree with what the state's doing, and they just sort of do it anyway. That's exactly how the COVID stuff went. They just said, well, we shouldn't have a lockdown protest, so we're just going to shadow ban all their Twitter and Facebook accounts. We're not going to actually formally do it. So they were clearly surveilling people throughout the time. In this sense, it's nothing personal per se, though. It's strictly anonymous. It's compared to historical surveillance, which was the opposite. It was actually someone hiring someone to do something. But there, all with all this modern technology here, I mean, this gets in almost Ted Kaczynski territory. With all this modern technology here, there is like there is a conspiracy theory about the origins of Facebook. For example, here that it was created the day after, you know, but people voluntarily post all that information on there. In a sense, some of the stuff that people post there used to be quote unquote private or not, as like family photo albums weren't just available for everyone to see. They were available, but then again, family photo albums are only actually 100 years old, and it really Polaroid pictures were in like the 70s and 80s. So that kind of thing, again, it's just a form of quote unquote surveillance. And based on one of the jobs I worked, many people have cameras on their doors. Many people have cameras in certain living rooms, and they do this for crime prevention. But I have no doubt that certain agencies could, in theory, and Edward Snowden, Oliver Stone, Glenn Greenwald have talked about this. Julian Assange has all talked about this. They could easily, stealthily turn on the cameras if the security is not that good. And then this quickly gets into the sort of conspiracy realm too. And this just becomes conspiracy. Sometimes it's just conspiracy fact. So, one of the ways, if you really want to avoid surveillance, you have to sort of give up a certain amount of modern technology, like Facebook, like Twitter, like Google Chrome. I mean, you can use other web browsers, but one of my problems is, are they as good? And does like Mozilla Firefox or some other browser, how secure actually is it? How much more quote unquote private here? If I'm just reading books about James Burnham, or looking at Google Maps, or checking my email, it's like I'm actually not that interesting of a person. Now, maybe I should be worried that that a company, and to some extent the state, has a file, in a sense, on all your reading and listening and whatever habits. That's something that could not exist in the past, of course. But I will say, like, there are benefits to example of the YouTube algorithm. I mean, I know there's studies that come out that say it pushed people left. That could be the case. There's also some studies that say it pushes people to the far right. That could be the case. I'm sort of dubious of these studies. But like, there's a debate I recently found, which if I didn't have a YouTube account, I probably would have never found it. Which was like a Peter Diamond debated someone on whether the Vatican II. I'm not really interested in talking about that in this episode, but that's something that the YouTube algorithm probably found for me. I would have never per se found it. Um, um, so to me, there is some quote unquote benefits to surveillance. And in terms of crime, I mean, this goes back to sort of, we had an episode about was Jeffrey Tucker right about Trump's wall, or was Ron Paul and Jeffrey Tucker right about Trump's wall? Because he made the claim that the wall would be used against certain elements of, well, this goes back to the war on terror too. That certain elements of the deep state and the NSA would be eventually used against domestic people, not just Muslim terrorists. Mainstream arguments withstanding. So I do. I mean, there are. If you do have a terrorist sect in your society and you want to weed it out, you're going to have to use surveillance. I mean, this goes back to the Pinkerton days of the labor union wars that occurred in many coal towns in the United States, and I think Britain has a similar history too. I do think how that should be resolved is a theoretical question here. I'm moderately sympathetic to that, to both sides of this issue. I think it's more complicated than either the new left historians or the sort of reactionary historians make it out to be. But surveillance definitely played a big role. And that's, in some sense, you see the predecessor of the modern surveillance state in that time period, the late 1800s. So, Swithin, do you think if you're sufficiently worried about surveillance, do you, in a way, have to give up a lot of quote unquote technology? Because a lot of things that, I mean, it just has, it's, if it's connected to a Wi-Fi router, it, chances are, can listen to your conversation. I mean, that's just seems to be the case. You can like that fact, you can hate that fact. It just is what it is. Do you think do you think it's purely paranoid to do so? We do have societies like East Germany that they did have a high degree of surveillance of their citizens, but again, a lot of that surveillance was by other citizens. Oddly enough, so so what do you make of my second set of comments towards to surveillance? Like, do you think it's a modern phenomena, the kind of alien, like, the sort of data collection and masse, Swithin?
Well, I think the data collection, as I said before, is different on the basis that it's collected sort of by not people who are not known to the individual, whereas historically, any surveillance would be done by people known to them. I think that's a relevant difference. But do you need to give up technology? I don't know, actually, because if you're really sort of good with tech, then you might be able to avoid it. That said, you are right. I think if you are really good and you know your stuff with the tech area and you want to remain sort of anonymous online, then you're probably not going to get a Google account, which will mean that you end up not making use of. So YouTube algorithm can be quite useful, as you pointed out. I suppose the ideal situation here, and again, I don't know why it doesn't exist. Maybe it's too expensive. That's why they need to keep the information to sell. Is that when you're online, you have your account and it keeps all the records of it, but somehow the companies may claim this happens anyway, but I'm dubious whether it does. Whereas you can somehow, or you only have like your own local copy, which is, oh, well, I suppose the downside of that is you might not be able to access it somewhere else. But anyway, they keep your information somehow, but somehow it's the equivalent of a really safe storage unit of some description. This is impregnable, and only you have the keys. Maybe something like I don't know, something like Bitcoin with a wallet, which I think you can access basically anywhere that you have like the um, your internet connection and connected to like the Bitcoin network, Bitcoin protocol, if you could have something analogous to that online that worked well, then you could argue that's the best of all worlds. The question is whether it does or not, because you are right. It does seem to be the case that the more encrypted and the less surveilled type ones may well have lower quality. That said, of course, I have been looking at some stuff claiming that the Google search isn't as good as it used to be because it, it's not very clever in that all the web pages which are search engine optimized come top, even though they're utter gibberish for half of it. Because, well, I hadn't thought about this, but apparently one of the reasons like why recipe websites have loads of nonsense at the beginning before they give you the recipe is because that's the way to get to the top on the search out by the search algorithms, because you have more than enough words in certain distance between each other so they can go higher up in the search rankings, even though it's not useful for people who actually want to find things. But yeah, it does seem to be the case that alt tech, as it were, doesn't function. I mean, a good example of that would be like Odyssey or BitChute. Their functionality is fantastically inferior to YouTube's. It's just obviously inferior. When it comes to who should watch and what's a problem, why is it a problem? I suppose you could argue one of the problems with a single large corporation surveilling you is that if they happen to not like you for whatever reason, then you might then become more difficult for you to function at all or reasonably in society as a whole. Which, on one end, you could say is a good thing because it can enforce orthodoxy and community values. On the other hand, if the community values are bad and you don't like them, then of course it's not a good thing. So I suppose you could say the surveillance, as it were, is in part a function of the problem of scale, in which you have the mega corporation, which you could argue that wouldn't exist in the freed market, for instance. Which then, of course, begs the question: well, if they did get mega corporations in the free market, would that be a good outcome? I mean, the Randians could certainly acknowledge that. I mean, I'm interested what they think on that, because a lot of sort of like, as you pointed out, the enforcement of new heresy laws is done by mega corporations who, if anyone deviates from sort of modern progressivism, which is traditional progressivism plus the sexual revolution plus less sort of race realism. If you deviate from that, then you're a pariah and you need to be sort of pushed outside of society. Which I suppose this then actually comes quite nicely along with our free speech episode or so too. I don't remember how many we did. Is for free speech to kind of mean anything, you kind of need a situation where there's like a freedom of consequences of some description for some speech, because otherwise your speech in a sense isn't hugely free. It's like the Idi Amin quote, there is freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee freedom after speech. Because even if they're not violating your Rothbardian rights, they're going to make your life significantly more uncomfortable in certain ways. Which is actually, as an aside, with like surveillance, what's justifiable or not is if it's the case that the road outside your house isn't sort of privately owned in a certain sense, well then it's kind of a free for all. Anyone can do what they want. So when it's been surveilled, it depends on the motives of them, how concentrated the data is, but also what I would say, and also whether or not the people who are surveilling you treat you as like an enemy or just like a lapsed citizen, which you could argue historically might have been more of the case because they have more of investment in you in the community, whereas now it's easier to treat you as sort of like the enemy, rather than the friend, to even if they're not necessarily the sovereign in the Schmittian sense. That might be more of the issue with the modern surveillance as it was historically, because of the anonymous versus sort of personally known situation which had been beforehand.
one of the interesting things is a lot of times people welcome surveillance, or they're the ones that implement it. For example, so take surveillance cameras. As I noted, people will install their own surveillance cameras in their shops and workplaces, as well as even their homes. So that's an area which was, in a sense, private. I'm not talking about them turning the TV microphone on or off. This is that you're actually putting a camera in there, and they're surveilling. I mean, people have to surveil their children when they're sleeping, or their young infants when they're sleeping, or things like that. This is sort of, in a sense, a modern day thing of people welcoming surveillance. Another area where I'm not sure if in England, but in the United States, you can the if you want to get a lower car insurance rate, you can get a device put in your car, which will somehow rank how you drive. And this device will, so of course this device knows where you go, and in a sense knows in a sense it's driving you think is private, but it's actually far from private. And this goes back to Google Maps. How does Google Maps and other version of Maps get their traffic data? They just know where everyone is. So actually during COVID, I stopped taking my phone sometimes because I know they were secretly tracking everyone. And if you could download the app if you wanted to, but how, like, if you ran into someone with COVID. This is what happens in China, for example. Someone in the mall entered the mall, they had COVID. Now everyone who was had their cell phone along with them is tagged with their ISP number is tagged. But then again, people voluntarily take along their cell phone here. So, like, this goes back to the adage: if you're not paying for it, you are the product. And in this sense, one of the reasons why these companies do it. Now, a lot of what these companies are doing are just selling you ads. So if they see you searching for cooking website, they might sell you cooking products. I mean, that's why Google AdWords and as but I will say there's a certain sense which things like Google, things like Facebook and Twitter, they sort of become what I think is called the natural monopoly. So I like you see like Truth Social. None of these sites ever take off because I think unless everyone's using them, then or at least a good amount of using them, it just doesn't really make sense. Like the eventually their Facebook or Twitter might collapse a new product, just like how MySpace fell apart. That might happen, but then in a sense, it's an update. MySpace is not Facebook. So there is a sort of the natural monopoly at play here. I do think that if you really, I do think in a sense that my person I was involved in the debate is right, in that most people, maybe even in East Germany, unless you're actively overthrowing the state, um, don't really have anything to worry in general about surveillance. Now, is that a black pilled message? Well, well, I think in this sense, Moldbug and even some of the other sort of right critics of like I think going to a January 6th protest was a dubious idea. I mean I'm not a never Trumper, but I do think it there are certain events which you're just sort of outing yourself. Yes, they should be allowed and they should be legal. They weren't harmful. But this is in a sense the state is a violent menacing organization that's looking for reasons to arrest you. Um, should you give them? I mean, Alex Jones himself said, "Don't go in there. Don't give them a reason to. They're looking for a reason to arrest you here." So I do think this goes back to our Schmidt episode that when it comes to the state, it does. If you're gonna be critical of the state, then in a sense this goes back to the free speech. You will unfortunately face some consequence if the state cares about it. Chris Catrone made a comment once in a lecture given at a thing. He could say anything he wants about Marxism in the 1920s and 1870s, but if he says something about COVID, the YouTube channel will get a strike. At the time, COVID was a big issue, so they get a YouTube strike here. Marxism, the state doesn't view as an issue right now, but if a Leninist party actually did emerge, then I think it would quickly become verboten to do so here. So I do think this is a corollary to our free speech episode here. So that's really ends my comments per se on this, Swithin. What do you make on opposing the state? One, And what do you make on welcoming surveillance into your life in the name of getting lower insurance or convenience? Do you think people do you think people should do that? If you could save 20% on your, fire insurance, or people even surveil, like I think train conductors sometimes have cameras in there. I think this has been like just to see if they're, if they do make a mistake or whatever, they know what's going on, so to speak. And again, police carry body cameras around too to surveil themselves. I don't think left libertarians have a problem with police carrying cameras around that have to be stayed on. But if they're being consistent, oddly enough, they should be critical of that. So, with any comments on that?
I think allowing the insurance company to know where you're going to get cheaper insurance, in principle, there isn't a problem with. I mean, that makes sense. I think ultimately it comes down to a situation where they're going to do things that are bad for you. So, a good example of this, I could have got a smart meter, um, which is a meter which gives like real time information to the electricity company about what I'm using and whatever, and I'll give you cheaper rates. You can check what's using all the electricity, you can save money and stuff. And I was like, well, no, because I have this sneaking suspicion that the government will use it and be using an excuse to turn off my electricity. Um, because when it's Earth Day, and so we need to turn it off or something like that. And historically, this concern about smart meters was considered a right wing conspiracy. And then, about a year ago, the British government said, well, yes, in an emergency scenario, we might stop your electricity coming through if you have a smart meter. So they were right, unsurprisingly. So again, it kind of comes down to what they will do with it. So again, with the insurance company, what might the insurance company do? It might give it to the police because, oh no, you were speeding. But again, the problem is the fact you have ridiculous speeding laws, which make no sense whatsoever. That's really so. In a lot of this, it's about things which ultimately should be absolutely fine, not really causing any problem, but are just an excuse to get money out of you. So that's the problem with when it comes to the government or with anybody kind of putting up a camera or something. It's, are they doing it so that they can get something out of you that they shouldn't be able to do? So even if it's a private company doing it, or even if it's the government, it's like, oh no, your bin was put out too early. And they'll just use it as an excuse to fine you more, or like cameras in like private car parks. You'll drive through it and then you'll go out again and go, oh, you didn't pay. It's like, yeah, but I didn't park. Oh yes, but you were in there for 5 minutes. It's like, well, how on earth is that justifiable? Oh yes, we'll look at the small print on this board. It's like, well, how on earth am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to read that when I'm looking around to park and decided, well, actually, we'd better going elsewhere? So you get these sort of unfair kind of, well, they're not even contracts because they're not even a meeting of minds. Uh, so that I think is one of the major problems with it. But I do think the more interesting one is, are there some things that you shouldn't know? So, for instance, supposing that you had a device in your room, maybe you had a duplex or semi-detached house, depending on the side of the pond you are, and you could listen really, really, really well to the sounds coming from somebody else's rooms. You don't have to physically go in there at all, but you could listen to everything they said. And it's like, well, is that really something that is a good thing? Should you know that? Well, maybe not. Maybe if they don't explicitly consent, because maybe there's kind of implicit views that what it takes place in the room stays in the room. So it's like, if you go to Fight Club, you don't talk about Fight Club. But again, then I suppose the question here is not individuals, it's kind of like third parties. And if third parties listen into Fight Club and talk about Fight Club, is that kind of a bad thing? I mean, even if you say should be illegal, fine, but whether they should do it and is that a moral thing to do is another question. That said, of course, if it's not illegal and there's no technological um, uh, inhibition, no, yeah, technological inhibition to do it, then people would probably end up doing it. So I do think the problem is ultimately what they will do with it. And I just think there's so many things today which are are good and fine for you to do, which end up being illegal, and so you can any group or anybody can come after you with a big stick and get stuff out of you, and that I think is the biggest problem we face today. If it was just these other situations, I don't think there'd be as much of a problem, and even if they were, there might be ways of um, dissipating your sound waves coming from your bedroom so it didn't go elsewhere so they can listen to it. I mean, that's of course possible with this kind of technological stuff. Any final comments, Tim?
As far as the people not being able to hearing things which they, in a sense, have an expectation of privacy. This goes back to the sort of work. How much work will you willing to do? Like for example, at restaurants, I have fairly good hearing, so oftentimes I can hear people's conversations at other tables. A lot of them are very boring, but every once in a while, if I'm at a restaurant alone, it's actually interesting. Now I think, am I doing what the NSA is doing? Well, you could choose to talk quieter. You could choose to stay at home. You could choose to eat outside. There's a number of ways you can make it less. I mean, I think this is like in a sense a surplus enjoyment here. Um, uh, you could just like, but but if you're not doing anything quote unquote criminal, then who cares if you overheard your conversation or gossip? It's just not that big of a deal here. Um i i do think privacy in some sense is it is an invention. It's an invention in the sense that I don't know where it exists. I mean, the Supreme Court brings up with abortion. I mean, that's the whole. Originally with Roe v. Wade, I know we're here in the United Kingdom, it's a little different there, but here in America, for a number of years, it was based on privacy. Apparently, privacy was in the U.S. Constitution, so sort of right. But to be fair, in a strange sense, they're correct that it is a quote unquote private matter. Typically, sex, reproduction, family. Those are typically quote unquote private. But a lot of the policies the state does also could be just unjustified on the same grounds. So, which is the classic criticism against us here. But if I'm listening to a conversation, or overreading it, like one of the better objections was made on Tyler Cowen's blog by someone. He said that if you read other Hillary Clinton's or Fauci's or Bolsonaro's or whoever's emails, George Bush's private emails, in some sense you're doing the same thing that the state's doing if you're being consistent. There was some brouhaha about what WikiLeaks released certain things. They've released emails that were deemed to be private here. Now, one argument can make is those are private, those are public, supposed to be public servants. They're supposed to be operating in the public's interest, so they shouldn't release them. And this goes back to the, how much do they want to hide them? I mean, there's certain, like Hillary Clinton in this sense was an idiot for using a email server that was, you should hide it better if you really wanted to be quote unquote private. So then what do you make? I mean, I sort of added on here, but like, how much work do you have to do? And like, if I'm overhearing people at a restaurant, am I engaging? Or if I'm reading, Anthony Fauci's emails about COVID policy that were, doxed or released, am I, in some sense, uh, violating his privacy?
Insofar as you're in like a restaurant, I mean, you can be overheard. So I think I mean, that's kind of like a semi-public space. I suppose you could argue that an individual house is like the private space, and is kind of like you could argue like people can kind of treat like a sacred space. It's kind of set apart. Although, as I said, you could, insofar as how many people live in a certain building historically and how many rooms they have. But I mean, historically, even with privacy, I mean, you could have just gone off to the woods and met somebody and talked to them, and so that would be sort of effectively private, as it would just be you two, and unless someone else knew that you were meeting, would be able to listen. Um, so I suppose as well. I mean, is it really I, the whole privacy thing for abortion was a joke? I mean, that was that's the kind of reasoning that the Catholics went in with, saying, well, the Council of Florence said there was no salvation outside the church. What they meant was the universal church of God, not necessarily, well, not necessarily that phrase, but not necessarily the church of the Roman Catholic Church, and so it's open to everybody, and some sort of, it was that sort of just, we wanted the conclusion, so we found the means to get there. So no, I don't think you're. So I think you are doing something like the NSA. I'd say the main kind of issue, I'd say, with the NSA is they're going to do bad stuff to you, and I suppose there's a question of whether or not contractually, whether people know that their information is going to be sold on, or it's going to be listened to, or whatever. But then again, you could say, well, what? How do you think we were a charity? So you can make lots of implicit argument type stuff like that. But I think you are to some extent a bit like the NSA. Um, uh, whether that's a bad thing, I mean, it'd be interesting. I mean, if you did get sort of like a social panopticon, because everyone can record everything and listen to everybody, whether that be a good thing, would people behave better? I mean, that's a, you have all this sort of surveillance on each other. But again, it's also an issue related to this, is that would somebody having known the information intervene to try to get you to do something you otherwise shouldn't do, or you otherwise wouldn't do? And it's like, leave me alone. And so then you're going beyond knowing and trying to directly influence rather than indirectly influence. So indirect influence, I would say something like, put an article saying in a certain circumstance you should do X, Y, Z, or use some sort of film which has a particular theme which promotes a certain type of behavior. I mean, that's kind of indirect. But direct is like people come to you and go, "Oh, I heard you were going to go this place. You were going to go in this industry, or produce this kind of product. Oh, that's a very bad product. You shouldn't possibly do that." And so you get sort of undesirable behavior, and then you get into the questions of, when should you, clearly, if you believe that someone's doing the correct action, you wouldn't intervene. And then when is it justifiable for somebody to try to directly influence somebody to engage in an action to prevent them doing an action they would do, or to get them to do an action they otherwise wouldn't do? I think we're kind of getting to that territory. But yeah, I would agree that finally that the arguments against surveillance are largely somewhat facile, and I think a product of a very particular point in history. And now I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And finally, if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.